Hello, my name is Dr. Mary Wendt. I'm going to talk about writing as a conversation and how to use sources well. So, this is for anyone who's given a writing assignment where they were told to use sources. I come across a lot of, I'm a English teacher, and I come across a lot of papers where students have been told they need to use sources, but they don't use them well because they don't have a solid understanding of why they are using those sources. They're using them because they were required. But if you want to use sources well, you need to understand why you are being asked to use those sources. So that is what this particular video is. So the first thing to talk about here is the idea of writing as a conversation. Um, Kenneth Burke, who was a famous philosopher and writer, he was very much into literary theory, rhetorical theory, things like that. An epistemologist, he talked about philosophy and aesthetics. So he wrote a book, and in this book, he talked about this notion of writing as being about this idea of entering a parlor. A parlor, for those of you who are too young to understand that term, or might be nobody uses it anymore. It's like a sitting room or a place where people go to, a place where your guests go to talk. So he talks about imagining that you go into a parlor where there's a conversation going on, and people have been talking about this conversation long before you got there. And you enter, you listen, you find out what's going on, then you enter the conversation, and you start talking to other people, and then the night gets late and you leave. And he uses this metaphor to talk about how writing is a part of joining this conversation, that there's a larger conversation out in the world around us, and that when we write, we are throwing our hat in the ring and we are joining this conversation. It's important to understand this concept right from the start as a writer, because you need to understand that when you write, you're not writing in a vacuum. Very, very unlikely that you're writing about something no one has ever thought of before. The world is filled with billions of people, and it's probably come up. So the idea is that there's a specific conversation. It's about a specific thing. And you, as a writer, are becoming a part of that conversation. You are joining this conversation. The conversation changes. It morphs as time goes on. History creates this conversation, and you join it at the point where you are alive. And then history continues, and you become part of that history. But it is a conversation. All writing is a part of that conversation. And it's important as a writer to know who is in that conversation and how your insight can become a part of that conversation. So this is about how to use sources and that idea of a conversation. So why use sources? I have 5 points here that I'm going to go over. Sources provide alternative viewpoints. They give you credibility. They support your ideas. They add depth to your argument, and they help you join the conversation. So those are the points I'm going to go over in more detail. So first, why provide these alternative viewpoints? When you provide alternative viewpoints to your position, it demonstrates to your readers that you understand the topic you are writing about. It's really important to understand that there's a conversation, that it's been going on long before you existed, and that you are joining it. And there are a lot of voices in this discussion. And by providing alternative viewpoints to what you think, you are showing that you understand that you are part of this larger conversation. It's important to demonstrate this, one, because it strengthens your ethos. You as a writer will be more credible, and people will tend to trust you more if you show that you have listened to the other voices. It also really appeals to your audience. So it works on that pathos. If someone is reading what you have written and they don't hear their voice, they don't hear their thinking, they don't hear or recognize the voices that they have heard in this conversation, they're much more likely to write you off, not trust you, or not listen to what you have to say. I'm sure you have listened to arguments that never have considered your perspective. And those are the ones you shut out and you don't listen to. So if you consider all viewpoints, alternative viewpoints, this is going to appeal to your audience and actually give you a broader audience. And it also shows that you are doing good critical thinking, that you've challenged your own ideas, you've pretended that you were other people, tried to walk in their shoes, shows that empathy and demonstrates that you are a good critical thinker and aren't just believing everything you're told. It really lights up your brain and will light up the brain of your. Secondly, how do sources give you credibility? So most of the time when we write, we're not the expert in the field. We are not the utmost person who knows more than anything else on anyone else on the planet about the topic we're writing about. So if you are not an expert, if you fall into this category, not an expert, then quoting the voices of people who are experts makes you credible because it says, I may not be an expert, but I've read the people who are experts. I've listened to them and I've considered what they have to say. You do not have to agree with or believe what they say, but if you do not talk about what experts say, then it demonstrates that you have not been paying attention to what experts have to say. So this means a couple of things. It means that you have to have credible sources. You have to make sure that the sources that you're quoting are not just, Joe Schmo's blog. You've got to make sure that they're credible, that they can be backed up, that they're people who are knowledgeable in their field. And this is important too. This has to do with using sources reliably. If you don't tell your readers who your sources are, they're not going to think that your source is a credible source. It's not going to give you credibility if you don't tell your readers who they are. Take the example at the beginning of this video. I talked about Kenneth Burke. Chances are pretty good you have no clue who Kenneth Burke is. But I told you who Kenneth Burke is. I am quoting from an expert, and because of that, you're like, oh, well, she's quoting someone, and she told us who Kenneth Burke is. I could have just quoted Kenneth Burke, never told you who he was or why he mattered, and that would not have given me credibility. If you don't tell your readers who your sources are, then the credibility doesn't exist. Very important. So the next point, how do these sources support your ideas? The important thing about when you're writing is to make sure that the context in which you're writing starts with you. Your writing is meant to contribute to the conversation, but your writing and your ideas should frame the voices of others and not the other way around. So this means you want to start with an introduction and a discussion based on your thinking, and then bring in sources to say, look, I'm not just making all of this up. Here are some experts who agree with what I had to say. So you want to make sure that you begin with your own discussion, and you want to make sure that you have solid topic sentences. Each of your paragraphs should start with something that you are claiming, a claim you are going to make, and then connecting to your sources. So you start with an idea, you back it up with people who know what they're talking about, and then suddenly they are supporting you and backing you up. And people will say, oh, okay, well, I didn't trust her, but now that she's quoted several people who are credible and know what they're talking about, now I can trust you. So imagine any time your reader might think this, but I don't trust you. And then make sure you back up what you say so that they will trust you, because that's very important. The next point, how these sources add depth to your argument. I want to look at this image of the tree here. And I really love the image of this tree, because if you do not use sources, or you don't use them well, you don't use them to back you up, you don't use them to support what you have to say or explain your ideas well, it's like having a trunk to a tree, but not having any roots. Those voices that come from the past, the voices of the other people in the parlor, the voices of the other people in the conversation are like the roots to this tree. All of those things have fed into and led into and become your thesis. So think of the trunk of the tree as your thesis and your main point and the one thing that you are really trying to get across. And make sure that you are using these sources to show that you have done your research and that you have listened to all these other people who have something to say. This gives your research, this gives your ideas depth and shows that you're not just a shallow thinker who didn't hear just one idea and go with it because it sounded good and you agreed with it, but that you really have listened to all of the voices that have contributed to what it is you have to say. And as a result, all these branches that come from the trunk, they're the results of what you have to say. They're the responses to what you have to say. They're the reasons why those things matter. So this is a really beautiful metaphor for writing as part of a conversation, sort of like a metaphor on top of metaphors, if you can wrap your brain around that. But these are the voices of the past. This is you, and these are the voices of the future. So there's a lot of depth to an argument if you use your sources well. So the last thing to think about, how do I actually do this joining of the conversation? I've been writing for a long time. I don't know how to actually go in there and do this well. Well, first of all, you want to make sure you avoid two things. One is the nodder. The nodder is someone who writes a paper and all the voices in the conversation are not the person who's writing the paper. Lots of sources, relying heavily on your sources, talking about what this person says and this person says, but not pulling them together and coming up with your own ideas. So you don't want to be that nodder. And I'm sure you've been in a conversation where there are several people standing around and there's one person standing there who just goes, uh-huh, uh-huh, oh yeah, oh yep, uh-huh, and just nods through the whole conversation but contributes nothing. You also don't want to be the one who doesn't listen. The never listener is the person who's standing amongst the group but is constantly waiting to just say what they have to say and has never really heard the other voices. So just using sources but not using them to inform your opinion is not the kind of writer you want to be. You want to use those sources and show that those sources have informed what you have to say. They back you up. You have synthesized them. And using these sources helps you join the conversation because it demonstrates that you understand. It will help you synthesize, take all those voices and put them together. This is a lovely picture of a whole bunch of voices put together to be one statement. And you want all those voices to synthesize to be one statement. And you want to make sure you stay on point. Joining the conversation means it's one conversation. You have to identify that topic, identify that conversation, and make sure you stay on track. So these are all the ways that this idea of a conversation as writing being part of a conversation can help your writing be stronger, and how to use sources really well and really effectively as part of that conversation. And there's my source.